Good evening. Welcome to the Wednesday, June 24th, 2020 meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. Some of us are here physically in City Council chambers, and two commissioners are joining us by Zoom. So just wave vigorously if you want me to call on you so I remember you're there. So anyway, we'll begin with item 1 on the agenda, which is approval of the minutes from June 10th, 2020. Are there any additions, corrections, deletions?
I gave Ann the one for Scrivener.
And I found one little typo I was going to show her, so yeah. Any others? Okay. Would somebody like to make a motion to approve?
Motion that we approve the minutes.
Thank you, Dennis. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Victoria. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Aye, both ayes on Zoom. And any abstentions? Okay. Moving on to item 2, which is public comment, which is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to the commission regarding matters that aren't before us tonight or pending before us. We have one member in the audience. David, did you want to get up and say anything? Nope. Okay, thank you. Moving on to item 3, approval of reasoned statement of relevant criteria and standards for our last consideration of a rezone of a 30-acre parcel located on South Highway 95, and Mike will present that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is the item we reviewed last meeting for the area city impact parcels, the 30-acre piece that they requesting a rezone from the agricultural forestry zone to the farm ranch zone, and the commission recommended approval to Latah County and forwarded that recommendation up to the county. And this is just the standard relevant criteria and standards document. It goes through the facts and conclusions, relevant criteria and standards, and then the decision at the very end. And I'd certainly be able to answer any questions that you have.
Any questions for Mike?
I gave him the Scrivener on that one.
I can't hear you.
I gave him the Scrivener on that one, too.
Okay.
So
In terms of content, is there any?
everything's good.
So this would go forward as a recommendation to accompany to the county zoning. So, for anybody, would somebody like to move to approve the relevant criteria and standards?
I move the approval.
Thank you, Joel. Is there a second?
Second?
It was a tie. Maybe Rob was the other second.
That was me.
No, thank you, Rob. Okay, we'll make sure we include the Zoom audience there, or participants, I mean. So all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Okay, so thank you. We'll move that one forward. So item 4 is a public hearing. It's a legislative hearing providing for the repeal of Moscow City Code Title 5, Chapter 1, providing for the amendment of Moscow City Code Title 4, Chapter 1, Chapter 4, and the addition of Chapter 12, providing for amendments to the bulk and placement regulations table, providing for the addition of traditional and conservation subdivision options, and providing for the establishment of procedures and standards for lot line adjustments, lot divisions, and subdivision plats. We've been working on this one for quite a while, probably almost a year, and had a citizen subcommittee, and Mike's going to present the final draft here for consideration. And go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Commission members. So this is the what we've been referring to as the Subdivision Code Amendment that, like Wendy mentioned, we've been working on for the last year or so. The Commission ended up finalizing the draft Subdivision Code in July of 2019, and then they formed a Subdivision Review Committee to review and provide recommendations on the draft. And part of that review committee was a subdivision developer. I believe we had Garrett Thompson, civil engineer Scott Becker, and land use attorney Susan Wilson, and then Rob, I believe, and Wendy were both the P&Z members that attended as well. And the committee met on October 18th and November 15th of last year and formed recommendations based upon those meetings. And then the commission went on to review the committee's recommendations at a meeting in January and February of this year. And then the commission amended portions of the proposed ordinance based upon the committee's recommendations. And so some of the recommendations the commission chose to accept, some of them they chose to not change based upon their recommendations. And so there was really a mixture. So that brings us to subdivision code organization. So this is the new layout. Previously, we had our subdivision code within Chapter 6, and we're proposing to relocate that to Title 4, which is the land use zoning code chapter of the city code. So this would be the new structure. We would have lot line adjustments, lot divisions, and then everything under subdivisions, and then we'd go into replatting. So that brings us to lot lines adjustments, which would be the first item. And then this is one of the items that we ended up, I don't think amending this, but more of a lot division was the item that we ended up amending based upon the committee's recommendation. But a lot line adjustment is essentially just a change in location, configuration, or alignment of a lot line or lot lines common between two or more lots, and they don't create an additional lot or lots. The process is going to be the request gets submitted to the zoning administrator, forwarded for review to the city engineer, fire marshal, building official, and then taking into consideration all the comments received, the zoning administrator ends up either approving the lot division as requested, or approving with conditions, or denying the proposed lot division. Typically what we're looking for here is just that it's going to meet the minimum lot size, lot width, and setback requirements for the zone that it's located in. And then the zoning administrator then mails out notice of the decision to the applicant, provides a summary, and then really just the process from there, and the deadline for submission of an appeal if they so choose. And then the appeal ends up at city council's hands within 15 days of being notified. Lot divisions, so this is where we ended up changing. So I think the commission was recommending that it be a lot division was enabling to create just one additional lot. The committee came back with a recommendation that we keep it at the existing 4 that we currently do. And so that's where we arrived, with the exception of the extension of public street right-of-ways. So a lot division would be creating no more than 4 additional lots for sale, use, or development, except when the division includes the extension of a public street right-of-way. And then it'd be a similar process to the lot line adjustment. You'd submit it to our office, forward it around for review, notice everybody within 600 feet, which is currently what we do, and then allows 15 days to submit written comment. And then you take into consideration of the comments that were received, and then, like the lot line adjustment, either approve with conditions, or deny the request. And then it wouldn't just be the applicant where we'd mail notice of the decision, it'd be everybody within 600 feet that was notified previously. And then, so we'd provide a summary of the decision, and then kind of the process for submitting an appeal. And then again, any affected person could appeal our decision to city council within 15 days being notified. And then the decision's not final until the expiration of the appeal period and the submission of a record of survey. And that brings us to section 12-3, which covers subdivisions. We're amended the subdivision definition to include division of land that results in a creation of more than 4 additional lots for sale or development, or any division that includes the extension of a public street right-of-way. So that little addition at the very end was part of the recommendation before. And then we go through the various other subsections, city approval required, parkland dedication required, public improvements required, and then going through laying out kind of the preliminary plat process, relevant criteria for subdivisions, phasing, which is allowed in subdivisions, kind of lays out and just explicitly states that phasing is allowed.
preliminary plat approval, and then final plat submittal, and kind of goes through the final plat approval, submittal and approval process. And then there's obviously a time frame for how long the approval for the final plat is, and so we define that there. And then the development and monumentation agreements. Replatting, so currently in the code, we don't address replatting, so that would typically just involve going exactly through the same process as you would for a typical subdivision. And then that brings us to subdivision design standards. We've got a purpose for the statement for the design standards. A lot of this refers back to all the different plans, multimodal transportation plan, our water and sewer plans, pathways plans, parkland master plan. It's really a mechanism to implement a lot of the various plans that we have, comprehensive plan, that aren't necessarily in ordinance form. And then the applicability, and then we've got subdivision or development name. So, every subdivision needs to be called something, and it generally we like to stay away from other subdivisions that are of similar names, just to distinguish, just like street names. We don't want to cause confusion. And then we go through street standards and access, and then the number of access points. So I think we talked quite a bit of detail about the number of access points. So previously this hasn't been codified in the code. A lot of this refers back to fire department standards, so International Fire Code standards as far as emergency services access points. If it's less than 30 dwelling units, there'd be one access point that would be required, 30 to 100, 2 access points, and then more than 100, no less than 3 access points. And then we have a kind of a safety relief valve in that the city engineer and council could waive could reduce one of the access points if it's demonstrated a few things, if it's adequate to ensure delivery of city services and emergency response, provide safe and efficient traffic circulation, and then another caveat there that the city engineer may require an increase in the number of access points, and this is just usually based upon unusual circumstances that exist on the lot. Then we go into street layout and connectivity, kind of street alignments, trying to continue, continuations of our pathway system, as well as our street network and the multimodal transportation plan and our thoroughfare plan and the comp plan. We try to discourage offset intersections just because safety conflicts there. And then gated streets prohibited. Street connectivity, and then we have this street connectivity index that we'd be introducing. Looking at, it's really just a ratio. We come out with a number, minimum connectivity index of 1.4, and really it's just the number of street links divided by the number of nodes and link ends. And so you go through and look at that, and then come up with the number, and if it met, then they're good to go. We're going to have maximum block length. This was something else that we talked at great length about. It's currently at 660. We don't propose to change that. Cul-de-sac allowances. Typically would recommend against cul-de-sacs except in unique circumstances. We have quite a few just based upon the topography of the Palouse, and there's no way around some of them, and so that's really what the paragraph that addresses cul-de-sacs states. And then we also have a maximum cul-de-sac length. And then so this kind of goes through the paragraphs where we talk about block length, essentially the 660 feet. And then it is a mechanism to implement pedestrian, bicycle, walkway connections. If there are block lengths that exceed that, especially if it's located along pedestrian routes and there's parks, schools, commercial services in the area where there's kind of those destinations, that we want to include pedestrian pathways. And so that's a way of, if they're exceeding the block length, to implement, kick in pedestrian pathways through those blocks. So the cul-de-sacs only allowed in limited situations where the street cannot be continued or extended due to extreme topography, existing development, or natural and man-made physical barriers. Preclude such street extension. And then maximum cul-de-sac length, it's the same as the block length, 660 feet. And then same language about the pedestrian connection if it ends up exceeding that, or if there's destinations that are desirable in the neighborhood. We go into pedestrian walkways, pedestrian walkway standards, lots, so lot arrangements, lot lines, usually, you know, wherever possible, corners lining up, perpendicular, through lots, you know, some of those lots where you have two frontages. It's inevitable that you'll end up with that sometimes, like Shelby and Joseph, that's one circumstance. Harold Street, that's the rear of some of those lots by the fairgrounds. You know, not the best as far as street frontage. Everybody's got a 6-foot tall fence on that side, so we try to limit those as much as possible, but sometimes they're just inevitable. Flagpole lots, just allowing for those. And then kind of going through pedestrian walkways. So this is kind of a general purpose statement for pedestrian walkways, and a lot of it's just the you know, necessary if you have those exceptionally long block lengths and other locations where you provide these destinations, parks, schools, shopping, to make use of pedestrian walkways throughout the subdivision. And then you've got a kind of a quantitative measure at the very end. Pedestrian walkway shall generally be required where the pedestrian walkway would reduce the average travel distance of pedestrians by more than 50%, or where otherwise required by council to mitigate potential safety hazards. And then we go through pedestrian walkway standards. Essentially, it's a 10-foot wide all-surface path. And then so we go through this before, lot arrangements, kind of logical and orderly, considerate of designated floodplains or wetlands. And then corner lots was one of the items that we discussed quite a bit at length as well. The committee recommended that we remove that. And then just because of the amount of staff time and the issues with setbacks on those lots, the commission chose to leave that in. But essentially, it's expanding those corner lots by 10% of the minimum lot size of the particular zone that it's located in, just to account for the additional setback requirements for the zone. And then flag lots are allowed. Then we go through parkland dedication requirements. And then stormwater management and conveyance, kind of stormwater standards, preservation of natural drainage courses, requirements for detention facilities. And if you recall, this is another item we discussed quite a bit, was parkland dedication. Go through and ended up adjusting the different zones based upon the percentage of parkland dedication to reflect the actual density that you end up achieving in those zones. So ag, forest, farm, ranch, 0%. And then as you go up into higher density zones, you end up going up into a higher percentage, up to R4 in residential, which would be 12%. And then we ended up reinserting commercial designations at the 12% requirement, and then had inserted the statement at the bottom there, subsection 3, which talked about, you know, within commercial zoning districts really is intended to meet the demand of the development of residential uses. And really that's what they're intended for. And if there's no residential uses, then no parkland dedication is required. But if there are residential uses, then we'll have to implement parkland as part of that development. So, and then the stormwater management and conveyance, just this is accounting for the increased stormwater runoff that accompanies impervious surfaces as part of development. And then the stormwater standards are just really referencing another portion of the code. We convey stormwater and detain it to the pre-development rate. And then wherever possible, preservation of natural drainage courses through a subdivision development. And this is a lot of times in order to provide greater opportunities for natural stormwater conveyance and treatment of the water as it ends up going through the creek. And then stormwater detention facilities just need to be constructed in accordance with city code standards. We go through utilities and easements, where lift and booster stations are required, typical utility easements for water, sewer, and storm sewer. Our flood hazard section, which hasn't changed a whole lot. Base flood elevation data needs to be provided if it's not really mapped in that area, which the whole city of Moscow is mapped, so that really wouldn't be a requirement. And then we've got required improvements. So this is kind of the design and installation of improvements, where public improvements are required throughout subdivisions, development agreements that ensure that, security that also ensures that those are completed, and then payment in lieu of public improvements for construction and the warranty period. And then other information about monumentation agreements. So just, every subdivision you're required to set corner monuments as well as street monuments. And then there's a security. And then there's other sections where we've ended up moving from a narrative format to more of a table format. So this was just inserting these in the bulk and dimensional standards. There was a section on minimum lot frontage that was a couple paragraphs, and we've condensed that and just incorporated that into the bulk and dimensional table. But those requirements haven't changed. They've remained the same. We've just put them in table format. And then this brings us to our different subdivision options that we ended up working on and discussing. The traditional subdivision option, which is more of a traditional neighborhood development pattern by smaller lot sizes, a mixture of housing types, neighborhood open space, but it's largely characterized by a gridded street system, street network with alleys, and a lot of the houses are rear loaded in this traditional subdivision option. So this is really just providing for an alternative. So it'd be like our conservation subdivision, which we'll get to next. The use of this section supersedes a lot of the requirements like minimum lot area, lot width, setbacks that are in other portions of the code. And it really just depends on what zone the property's in. We'll determine what the lot size is and lot width and setbacks and things of that nature. Parks and Rec Commission makes a recommendation to City Council on the open space. So the give and take for the larger, the more dense development is that there'd be a greater amount of open space that'd be required to be dedicated. And Parks and Rec Commission always reviews parkland dedication requirements. And so they would review that, make a recommendation to City Council on the suitability for the open space for parkland. And then there's some standards that they should follow. So meeting functional parkland dedication requirements, be dedicated to the public, managed by the City of Moscow, and be located in one contiguous area unless determined to be more beneficial in multiple locations. And then we have development standards for traditional subdivisions. So the streets, looking at, once again, the grid network. Cul-de-sac or other dead-end streets shall only be allowed in limited situations. And then the lot shall be designed for rear access via an alley to allow the front of the building to be located closer to the street. So this is in order to really enforce the traditional neighborhood, building wall as the lot's pushed as close to the street as possible. Just really reinforces the pedestrian-oriented environment. And then alleys shall serve all building lots unless special circumstances that preclude that exist. And then that brought us to the kind of bulk and dimensional table that we put together for traditional subdivisions. So goes through kind of the residential zones, R1 through RO. There's a minimum development area, and then you're looking at minimum lot area, single family, 5,500 for R1, and then it goes down from there all the way down to 2,500 for RO. And then twin homes start in R3 because that's the zone where they start to be allowed. 3,250 all the way down to 2,250, townhouses 2,000 all the way down to 1,800 in residential office. And then looking at the lot width, R1 50, so these are quite a bit less than what you would normally see. So for instance, R1 is 80 feet. And so it's anywhere 30 to 40% reduction in lot area and lot width. And so it just goes across the groupings there as far as single family, twin home and townhouse, and then R1 through RO. And then the setback requirements are quite a bit less as well, except for the rear. Rear's just a standard 20, but the front are 10. And those range anywhere between 25 feet and 15 feet for R4 and RO. So quite a big reduction in setbacks. Side yard minimum has just remained 5, but there's no combination of requiring both sides to equal 15. It's just a standard 5. And then the street side's 10 as well. And then common open space really ranges from 9% to 14% when you get up to RO. And then effective maximum net density, you can get all the way up to 24 units per acre if you're looking at R4 or RO. And then maximum building height, another item that we discussed quite a bit and then ended up increasing that as well as a result of that discussion. So 35 in R1 up to 40 in R4 and RO. And that brings us to the last section, which is the conservation subdivision option. And so this is really intended similar traditional subdivision, only intending to be almost more rural and preserving more open space, such as floodplains, steep slopes, wetlands, critical habitat, natural areas. But we didn't want to limit it to just having, specific sensitive areas on properties. It could just be general open space. And so we left it open so you could just, preserve open space in general, not necessarily sensitive areas. Just like traditional subdivision, this supersedes a lot of the requirements in the code. The common open space, once again, Parks and Rec Commission makes a recommendation to council. And then we've got some standards for the common open space. Needs to meet the functional parkland dedication requirements, dedicated to the public, managed by the city of Moscow. One contiguous area, unless determined to be more beneficial. And then prioritize preservation of important natural areas such as agricultural land, floodplain, wetlands, steep slopes, wildlife habitat, riparian area, or other natural features. However, in the event there's no natural area identified upon the property, utilization of the conservation subdivision for preservation of open space in accordance with the design standards table may still be permitted. So just making that explicitly clear that it's still allowed. And then the bulk and dimensional table for conservation subdivision is similar to the traditional subdivision table as well. Just a little bit more of an increase in open space requirement for the conservation subdivision option, but still being able to achieve 24 dwelling units per acre in like an R4 and RR zone. So that brings us to really the commission action, and staff's recommendation is to consider public testimony, and having considered that testimony, recommend approval of the proposed ordinance to City Council with no modifications. Commission can certainly recommend approval of the ordinance with modifications, or recommend denial of the ordinance. So.
Thank you, Mike. Are there any questions for Mike? I do.
I've got a kind of a generic question, but it could, I don't have to do it right now, I can do it at the end. I would, since we don't have people here listening, if my friendly council person comes and asks me, what 3 things would I tell them that this was better than what it replaced? how would you categorize fairly quickly the improvement that this is over, over the ordinance that we have? Is it shorter?
Is this a test? Well,
I mean,
there's
there's
a number of.
42 pages.
Well, it's
What-
yeah, it's certainly not shorter. Well, part of the issue is that currently we have a process for lot line adjustments and lot divisions that's fairly awkward. It goes to city council for a simple lot line adjustment. It's required to go to Public Works Finance Committee and then on to city council. Really, for a lot line adjustment, you're only reviewing it to make sure it's going to meet the minimum lot size, the lot width, and that the proposed lot line will meet all, the structures will meet all setback requirements. Staff could certainly do that easily. There's really no reason to have that process that goes through council right now. Lot division process is a bit of an awkward process as well. Currently, lot divisions and lot line adjustments aren't in our code. It's more of just how we administratively process those. Lot divisions end up with a similar process. They go to city council, it goes to Public Works Finance Committee. It's noticed as a public meeting, but not a public hearing, which means that it's open to the public, but it's up to the chair of the Public Works Finance Committee as to whether or not they accept public testimony, which they almost always do. And then lot division is similar. If it meets the minimum lot size, lot width for the lots that it's creating and setback requirements, then there's really no, real reason to deny a request like that. But you end up with 3 members of the council that are conducting a public meeting and making a recommendation, which is problematic because it's only 3 members of the council.
So you're saying to me that it makes life simpler for our council?
Well, I think also for developers, when we had our little subcommittee, they talked about, they were hoping to streamline the process in some of this. And I think it's achieved
Yeah.
that.
I know we've heard the word streamline, but I worry about the number of pages and
They have to read, but they
So-
don't have to go through so many meetings.
we've spent a year on this, or more, and we haven't argued about too much of it, a little bit. So I don't have any big issues, but I keep trying to tell myself that I've been doing something pretty good.
Well, I
And
think
just want
we've
Mike to
introduced
remind me how good it is.
We've introduced 2 other, we could have done more, sure. and we can always do more. But we introduced 2 new forms of development that aren't just the traditional
right.
subdivision that we see
Uh,
today.
uh,
And I think, and they promote more connectivity, I think, and more efficient land use and more preservation of open space and help to forward the comprehensive goals, plans goals more effectively. And the developers seemed interested in those options. I didn't think, I was surprised, but they did. They said, oh, this is kind of, we'll see if they do anything with them, but the option is there now, and it wasn't before, really, to do that. So I think, to me, those are the forward-looking aspects of this. One thing I had a question about that I kind of slipped through, when we talked about, for the conservation subdivision, we talked about the option of, say, there's no real natural feature to preserve. Maybe it's a wheat field. I think we left that a little too open-ended, that I think it's fine that it was a wheat field, but it needs to be transformed into something besides a wheat field to be really qualify for an open space subdivision. And I think we sort of fell short in prescribing what standards should be met there, and I don't know quite, do you know what I'm talking about? Like, it should be maybe returned to a natural habitat, but not just a thistle patch or something, So how do we address that issue, or how do you think it will be addressed? If somebody comes in, they have an old farmstead, it's all wheat fields, they want to put a, open space subdivision on it, there's really no natural features other than, because it's been so altered by agriculture, what, you know, how do we handle that? How will we handle that?
Well, the Parks and Rec Commission will review that,
Uh-huh.
and that'll be part of the process, is that they review the parkland. We have the standards in there, so it states that, yeah, if there are those kind of natural and beneficial areas, that those do get preserved.
Right.
If it happens to be that there aren't any such features on the land, there's another standard in there that talks about it needs to meet the functional parkland dedication, which
Okay.
means that it's a standard park. So they would look at the standard park requirement, and then everything in excess of that they're required. Maybe that is a natural area that doesn't resemble a typical park that you'd see around the city. But I think that with that direction, the Parks and Rec Commission can certainly weigh in on that. And even though Parks and Rec Commission is providing a recommendation, this commission could certainly provide a recommendation as to that as well before it goes on to council. And then council has the ultimate say. If
As
they-
we review each?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was something that I thought we maybe could have fleshed
Yeah.
out more, and we didn't, so. But, you know, I know, Nels, you were looking for 360-foot blocks like I would have hoped for, but, you know, it's,
Well, you know,
there's
it's
more
that
points
sort
of
of keep it
connectivity.
simple, stupid issue that is, and you'd like to be able to just say, we really, I thought the charts added something. I thought it simplified some things so you could get to a point. And so that's one thing that I thought was useful, and I think we all tended to agree with that. But after a year goes by and I'm old, I just need to be reminded what a
Well, to me, the
good thing
strength,
we did.
that would be a strength, and also just the options for alternative forms of platting subdivisions.
And I think some of the options
Yeah,
offered are good as well. It gives a couple of varieties, but you get what I'm trying to, it just reminds me of droning on for 2 hours to a bunch of students at the university, and then try and say, well, what did you just say to us, Professor Reese? Oh, well, we talked for 2 hours, didn't we? Yeah.
so does anybody else have any questions
I think
for
it's
for
good.
Mike? Okay, so we need to open the public hearing? Oh, how about on Zoom? Is there, Joel or Rob?
Go ahead and open it.
Okay, we'll open the public
I'm
hearing.
good as well.
And would anyone here like to speak about this issue before us? Yes, David, you want to come up and introduce yourself? State your name and address, please, and
David Hall, 1334 Wallen Road, Moscow. Under the Conservation Subdivision and perhaps other areas, you might consider mentioning Palouse Prairie explicitly. I just learned they're working in Pullman on pocket parks where they found some native Palouse Prairie and protecting that and educating the landowners and the public and so forth. So Palouse Prairie's getting pretty well known, and it might be worth just explicitly mentioning that. Thank you.
thank you. Anyone else? I guess there's no one else here present, so we will close the public hearing and deliberate among the commission. I almost went that far myself, David, and when I was just in the point I was just bringing up, that if you're trying to transform what was a wheat field, a sort of sterile wheat field, into something that's a natural area, that, you know, that would be one of the approaches that a developer could take to create a more natural environment or habitat, et cetera. Dennis, yes.
Sounds good, looks good.
So, in response to David's comment, at the very end here, under common open space, page 17, prioritizing natural areas such as, we can just add in, you know, we could, and where it says, or other natural features such as, again, or just put in, Blueberry, because that is something that is being focused on in this area. As an example.
I know it's not as easy as one would hope to be able to restore a natural spruce prairie environment. That's why I'm reluctant to say somebody has to do it, but
No,
it would be a
it's
nice
not a
idea
have.
if it could.
It's not a have to, it's a
Right,
prioritize doesn't mean you have to do it, it
Right.
just means you're looking for it.
so any
Well, anyway,
other,
that's where I saw where
the opportunity,
an
yeah,
opportunity to
Yeah.
put it in there. if we want to.
agreed.
I would agree with Victoria that it would be perhaps useful to include somewhere in the verbiage the words Palouse Prairie. I'm a strong supporter and have wandered around several Palouse Prairie restoration projects, and we certainly don't want to mandate it, but it wouldn't hurt to suggest it as a possibility.
Right. Well, does, let's see, other comments, and then we might work on the wording of that a bit in the motion or something. Yeah, I had put down the note, restore to natural habitat, as an option, but that's, Palouse Prairie is more specific.
So I have a question.
Unfortunately, I don't think we have much of any remnants of natural Palouse Prairie that are likely to be within Moscow's city limits anytime soon.
At one time, we talked about not just natural areas, but historic significance.
If there was a
we had an
barn
old
or
fort
something.
here or something, you know, and that sort of stopped being talked about at some point, and I've always wondered if maybe it's a natural feature, but could also be a historic feature.
So,
We might uncover some piece of ground that turns out to have a historic value we didn't know about. And,
right, it could
I
have
don't
been
know.
a
Because we
site
tend
where
to-
the
we tend
Nez
to look at-
Perce and the Coeur d'Alene tribe, interacted or something, you know, for example, or, are you talking about structures, like historic structures?
Well, anything. I don't know.
Preservation of important natural, is historic, or, I mean, just adding the word of historic or important natural areas?
My general feeling at this point is that we've struggled with this for at least a year. We've had lots of time to look at it. We could struggle with it for another year and fuss with this word and that word. I'm ready to send it forward. I think if we can always find another word to change and put an S on it or something. And in my mind, we've had plenty of time to do this. So my observation, I guess my inclination is to move that we send it to council.
Right, so you're making the motion.
I would move that we, yeah, no, I don't know if you want to do that, but I don't find picking on little things at this moment after we've been working on it for a year is significant. If there isn't a few errors in this, I'd be dumbfounded.
Right.
But it's a working document that we've, I think, agreed on. And so I would move that I would make a motion that we send it forth to the council for approval.
As written. Okay, is there a second?
I would second that.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And Rob also, I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, he said
Aye.
this.
Okay, opposed? Abstentions? Okay, so, we don't need to have any relevant I mean, it's an ordinance essentially, right? So we're pretty much done. Okay, so, the next item is, small cell wireless facilities draft ordinance, and Michael Ray will bring us through the latest, update on that.
Okay, thank you again. So this is just picking up a conversation. I think this was prior to COVID shutdown is the last time we talked about small cell wireless facility ordinance. So just to recap, the city's existing code for telecommunications doesn't address small cell facilities. Looking at moving forward with objectives for our small cell program, to provide reasonable access to the desired services, minimize visual clutter on utility poles, ensure the installations are aesthetically pleasing, and then ensure the installations do not obstruct sidewalks, roadways, and don't interfere with light fixtures or functions, and to create a permitting system that can facilitate required processing times that the FCC has put into place. And then also to coordinate utility and streetlight owners as part of this. So looking at our existing code, currently does not distinguish between some of the larger 60 to 100 foot macro cell towers and then the small cell poles that you would have for small cells. And the new towers poles would require a conditional use permit. So if you're looking at applying the small cells to our existing code, it still would require a conditional use permit if it was going to be a new tower or a new pole. Co-location is the placement of one or more antennas on an antenna support structure, or the placement of an antenna on an antenna tower on which one or more antennas are already located. So if you look at the definition of what an antenna support structure is, it's really anything that it wasn't originally intended to be a antenna tower, antenna support structure. So that could be a light pole, that could be a telephone pole, that could be on top of the McConnell building, could be on top of Theophilus Tower, could be really attached to anything that wasn't originally intended to be an antenna support. So that's really what makes up co-location. So if you were to co-locate, put a antenna, small cell antenna on top of a light pole, that would really be allowed by right as it currently sits throughout the entire city. It's all in all zoning districts, so long as it doesn't exceed more than 18 feet above or 8 feet away horizontally from the support structure in residential districts, and then it ends up being able to project further in commercial districts. So that's really the concern we have, right now, is that we have no standards in place with our current ordinance if there was small cell activity that started to occur in Moscow. So looking at the draft small cell ordinance, we really go through the definition of what a small wireless facility is. This is kind of standard definition. The FCC uses this, and most other jurisdictions use the same definition. And then we have small wireless facility standards, which would apply to new facilities as well as co-location. And then looking at in circumstances where there'd be co-location upon existing support structures, it'd be a permitted use. Although the antennas couldn't extend more than 5 feet above, 2 feet horizontally, along with equipment, must be shrouded in certain equipment shroud boxes. If it's side mounted,
there's certain heights above sidewalks and roadways. I believe it's 8 feet above sidewalks, 14 feet above roadways. And it also has a limited size that the shroud can be. If it's top mounted, usually there's just antennas, kind of cantennas that are the top mounted. Can't exceed more than 5 feet in height, and then it also has a limited outside diameter of 14 inches. And then the equipment can't interfere with street lighting. Looking at the circumstances where there be a replacement of an existing support structure, so if you were to just take the entire light pole down, replace it with a new combination light pole and antenna tower, those are permitted so long as the replacement is the same quality, color, design, style of the original, same height. And that's just the light pole itself. It excludes top-mounted antennas, which are just subject to the standards that we had before, so they can't exceed the 5 feet above or 14-inch diameter. And then designed to internally accommodate all equipment, so really no shrouds on the outside, no equipment boxes, has to be all internal to the pole itself. And then decorative or historic light fixtures can't be replaced unless the applicant demonstrates that the proposed replacement antenna support structure will not disrupt or interfere with the visual theme or style of lighting within that area. And then this is just straight new small wireless facility towers. It's 40-foot height limitation unless a conditional use permit is applied for and received through the Board of Adjustment. Designed to internally accommodate all equipment, so really only one shroud is permitted. Should be located no closer than 250 feet away from another small wireless facility antenna tower. Doesn't apply to towers that have been as a result of co-location or the replacement combination. So if they're a light pole and the antenna pole combination, then the 250 feet wouldn't apply. And then tower shall consist of a powder-coated black steel pole, no more than 14-inch diameter antenna shroud. And then as part of this, I had included a copy of Mia Batista's, our city attorney's legal opinion. And then at the very end, she kind of goes through a number of important court cases, and then at the end, goes through some conclusions about what the city is allowed to and not allowed to do. City's allowed to develop application criteria processes so long as the criteria and processes are reasonable, clearly defined, and ascertainable. Develop reasonable and targeted construction standards. Charge the presumptively reasonable fees set by the FCC or set fees that are non-discriminatory and represent a reasonable approximation of the city's reasonable cost. Implement reasonable and not overly burdensome aesthetic restriction requirements that may include factors such as technical feasibility, compatibility with nearby land uses, traffic safety, coordinate various uses, protect integrity of historic, cultural, and scenic resources, minimize spacing, and underground infrastructure in specific circumstances. Then it goes through what the city's not allowed to do, place a moratorium on the deployment of 5G small wireless facilities in our community. So we go through a couple of different types. No express moratoria, where we implement laws, regulations, or legal requirements that expressly, by their terms, prevent or suspend the acceptance, processing, or approval of applications or permits. And then a no de facto moratoria, where our local actions would effectively halt or suspend the application process. And then city's also not allowed to deny an application for installing 5G wireless facilities on the basis it will produce radio frequency emissions, or implement criteria or standards that will materially inhibit the deployment of small wireless facilities. Wendy and I ended up attending Sustainable Environment Commission on June 16th to discuss the draft ordinance. As you recall, Sustainable Environment Commission was looking at the ordinance and 5G as well, specifically for the RF emissions and potential health concerns. And we wanted to discuss more of a unified recommendation with SEC's recommendation on that as well. Sustainable Environment Commission ultimately recommended that planning and zoning continue with the draft ordinance, which would address safety and aesthetic concerns, and SEC would continue to research, monitor the changing legal landscape on radio frequency emissions and potential health effects. And then they were looking at potentially a future date. They may put forth a recommendation to address health concerns if a legal avenue becomes available. We had quite a lengthy discussion on that, and Wendy can certainly talk a little bit more about that if you want to. But yeah, that was kind of our last thing that prior to the COVID shutdown. That was the next step. Was that we were planning on going to Sustainable Environment, getting their take on this, and then reassessing our draft ordinance and then moving forward. So. Now that we've met with them and provided a recommendation, are there other items that you see that are lacking that you want to address in our ordinance? Or I know there's been quite a bit of public comment. David submitted quite a few comments, and George Pedestrian had sent an email, and I forwarded that to everybody earlier this week. A lot of those, I think George's comments address indemnification. A lot of things that are included in a master license agreement that the city would have with the provider. I could certainly, if the commission's concerned about those items, not necessarily being in an ordinance and being in an agreement that's just between the city and the provider, I could certainly share our template. I don't know if, it's the city attorney had drafted the license agreement, and I don't know, trying to envision planning and zoning's role in submitting comments to a legal agreement that our city attorney put together. But I could certainly bring those concerns up with her about not having some of those indemnification and warranty and things like that contained within the ordinance itself, and get her opinion as to whether or not she thinks it's all right just to have those in the license agreement, or if she'd be all right with inserting that type of language in the ordinance itself. That seems to be one item that it has just come up over the last couple meetings that we might be able to get some clarity on.
It might be worth checking with her, I guess. I don't think any of us here are legal experts, so.
Mike? Whose responsibility is it to verify the engineering of existing poles and pole bases for added structure and weight?
It would be, it's likely going to be the cellular provider. I mean, we would need to have that documentation in our office from a licensed engineer and have the plan stamped by the engineer to verify that it's going to meet everything. But whoever works that out between the owner of the pole and the cellular provider, I would imagine that it's going to be dependent upon the cellular company in order to provide that. But, between two companies, I think it'd probably be whoever, whatever agreement they reach mutually between the two companies, but someone would need to verify that for our office to accept, approved plans that would modify a existing pole or install a new pole, so.
And I think the idea with SAC was that the commission members themselves weren't all on the same page yet in terms of what, how they wanted to impact or interject anything into the ordinance. And so the discussion was kind of left that, well, we need to move forward because otherwise we're going to be vulnerable as a city without an ordinance in place, and they can always come to us with an amendment at some point if they all agree that, there's something that related to health, et cetera, that would make sense. I mean, that was the way I understood it, but that they also realized that we needed to move forward. And we got confirmation from Steve McGee, the chair, this week in an email, that's how he heard it also. So,
Wendy,
Yes.
Hi, can I ask Mike a question? The comments that George Bedarian, is it, that he provided were rather detailed, extensive. Has the city attorney reviewed those comments?
I have not forwarded those to her. I don't know if he forwarded those to her individually, but I was planning on having that discussion with her on those comments. Because a lot of them include the indemnification and warranty and things of that nature that aren't necessarily in our ordinance, but are in our master license agreement, so.
Yeah, I think it would be instructive for us if we had her read on some of those. Some of it I'm with Wendy. I don't have the technical expertise to comment on a lot of them, but it would sure be helpful to know how the legal aspect of that and whether we should incorporate some pieces of it.
Yeah, I could certainly do that.
So what type of schedule do you think that puts us on, Mike? We would probably need another discussion of this before we would
Yeah, I
go
think
to a public hearing?
Yeah, I think we'd probably be uncomfortable with a public hearing prior to getting those the discussion from the city attorney. So I can visit with her. I know that we discussed potentially canceling our first July meeting, so I would have those answers by the second meeting in July, and then if everybody was comfortable with the response, then we could proceed maybe after that to a public hearing.
Okay. And I had made a suggestion, if there's nothing really critical on the agenda, that we consolidate a little bit under the current circumstances, plus having any kind of public hearing so close to the 4th of July when people are distracted and out of town was probably not a good idea anyway. So going ahead and canceling that meeting unless any of you have that.
So I have a question still on cells. Are we pretty sure that we're not going to get a proliferation of cells? Like when you look at the water towers and there's shrouds all over the place. You look at the Theopolis Tower and there's shrouds all over the place at the top. I wouldn't want to see our downtown buildings, which are much lower and in your face, have a ton of shrouds on them. That would not look good. And I want some assurance that that's not going to happen.
Well, those certainly would fall under the co-location and would be allowable. There's nothing that's in the ordinance that would prohibit somebody mounting a piece of equipment to the side of their building.
A piece is one thing, a proliferation of them, like what we see on the top of the Theopolis Tower, where that top has got tons of those shrouds. And if you look at the water towers, like up on Residence Street, it's got, I wouldn't want to see our downtown buildings, or really any building, with a whole mess of them, and it would look like a mess, even though they're in shrouds. So that's my question. The logistics of whether we could get that, or whether we wind up with that or not, because I don't want to wind up with that.
So the 250-foot spacing is only for new?
Yeah,
It's just-
does that
yeah, it's
prevent
just
that
for
or
new.
not?
Whatever happened to that 660-foot block? Let's put them on the corner of every block at 660 feet.
So, yeah, if you go to page 6, and you look at the co-location upon existing antenna support structures, so maximum number of shrouds, only one equipment shroud containing all required small wireless facility equipment shall be installed per antenna support structure. So, one building, an entire building would be a antenna support structure.
Okay.
So they would be limited. I mean, you'd be able to install at least one provider on one building, but you wouldn't be able to, proliferate the building with
Yeah, that
shrouds.
was my concern.
Yeah.
Because Theopolis Tower is proliferated.
Yeah.
So,
Yep, you would just get essentially one per building.
Yes, Sandra?
So Wendy, before all the COVID hit, I know that there was a brief discussion about talking to the Historic Preservation Commission about this and what places might be off limits in terms of putting these up, but then I know that you haven't been able to hold any meetings. Is that just sort of gone by the wayside, or is that still a consideration?
Well, it's definitely been on,
Yeah.
on hold. And so, yeah.
I didn't know if there were any emails that went through or any places you'd be like, we don't want it on the McConnell Mansion, or we don't want it on a school, or, I don't have examples, but I just wondered if that'd gone anywhere through emails with the group.
Well, I guess my question for Mike would be, you have to have permission of the building owner to place, I mean, you can't, the utility company, the companies can't just come and put them arbitrarily on any downtown building. They have to have the permission of the owner, presumably.
Yeah, I would presume that as well.
And so we're pretty vulnerable because we don't really have any historic district ordinances protecting buildings. It's all just kind of an honorary system. So that would be my
Yeah.
that would be why I'm hesitant to say, oh yeah, we could do that. I think about also just in terms of health, what if you're renting an apartment on the 4th floor and they put it right next to your window,
Yeah.
But that's not our area of expertise, I realize, but there's nothing really to prevent them from doing that right now. I don't know. And, do you think we would have any clout with historic preservation to even pursue that, Mike, in terms of, since we don't really have, we just have honorary districts, national historic districts. We don't have local historic districts, which have restriction capabilities.
Yeah, a lot of the other ones that I've seen, like Lewiston has language, like their Normal Hill, Heritage Overlay District. They actually have districts that have a review process, and it'd be a certificate of appropriateness that they already have in place for any type of addition, alteration, construction of a new structure in that district. Yeah, we don't necessarily have that in place. I haven't really seen any that haven't had the mechanism to review, have a commission, Historic Preservation Commission review already in place prior to implementing standards to say that they would need to go through the Historic Preservation Commission to review this.
It's interesting because when our mission is described, it actually includes that ability for oversight, but we don't really legally have it because we don't have an overlay district. So even though
Coming
it's,
back to what you said, I'm assuming, are we correct, that they can't just go in and plop a cell tower on some building without the owner's consent?
Yeah, the owner would have to consent to it. We would have to approve it through, if we pass this ordinance, we would have to approve that's location, not necessarily its location, but that it met all the standards that we had in the ordinance. But yeah, the owner of the building would have to approve the placement of the
Right,
antenna shroud and antenna on the building.
on the actual building.
and generally, would they be rooftop installations, do you think, primarily?
Well, for small cell, the range is 300 to 500 feet.
Right.
So depending upon, I think you'd probably want it. That's why a lot of them are on utility poles, is that in order to maximize the range, they need to be at that height instead of on the top of
Okay,
Theophilus
right,
or
right, right,
McConnell.
gotcha.
Where did your figures come from, like how high it could be above the building, and where'd you get those numbers at?
We compared other ordinances, but it was drafted off of large of the city of Denver.
Okay.
Have they had much deployment, do you know?
Denver?
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe so.
So is there any way because we have brought this up, that if you're in an apartment building
Right.
and it's 10 feet from the street and then there's the pole right in your face, that there's no distance to speak of. Is there any way for us to address that?
I mean, we just talked to the city attorney, but I don't really see any way to distinguish because you have telephone and light poles that are that same distance away. So how do you distinguish one of these poles that has antennas on it from the utility pole and a light pole if you're not able to draw a distinction in emissions and health concerns? So if you're not able to regulate it based upon health concerns,
Right.
there'd be really no reason why you would treat antennas differently when they look the same as a light pole or a telephone pole that could be that distance away from a apartment as well.
But aren't they admitting wireless out and the other ones are kind of like hardwired? That's no different?
It's not, it's radio frequency waves, not
Yeah.
necessarily wireless internet.
It goes down exponentially with every foot that you get away from the source in terms of, but I was thinking more of a building mount right outside somebody's window, And that, if the owner said, yeah, sure, go ahead. But anyway. Yeah, well, it would be helpful if you could get some of these questions answered by the city attorney, and I don't know, yes, sorry. Rob or Joel, do you have any other questions or concerns that you want to bring up with it?
No, I don't have any. It's a very slippery topic. It's a difficult one.
It is. We don't have much leeway.
Right.
And for me, I think that the Denver examples were good. Mill Valley seemed to loom large in some of the suggestions. I think I would just be comfortable having the city attorney look at those. And I guess my feeling is that to the extent that we have the ability to kind of clamp down on this a little bit, it's a lack of a better term, but I want to make this as restrictive as possible within this FCC guideline that we're obligated for. So I just would be really interested in the city attorney's view on how restrictive we can get.
Other comments? Okay, Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add, or is that, okay. So, Joel, Transportation Commission meeting report. Has the Transportation Commission met?
Transportation Commission has not met. I believe we are scheduled to meet next month. And I believe it's going to be in the council chambers, and I may still attend by Zoom. I'm not sure, but there is, as far as I know, there isn't an agenda out yet.
So I have a question in general, for commissions that aren't quasi-judicial. Are they going to meet in July, or I had heard a rumor that it would not be till August, that the normal commission meet. Where are we with that?
Yeah, they've put out direction on that, and it would be, I think, the end of June, essentially, is when we could start meeting. So pretty much right now.
Okay. All right. Well,
The mayor made a comment in city council that the commissions, so many of the commissions have been coming to him saying, when do we get to meet? When do we want to get to meet? We want to get some work done. So I think they've been sensitive to that to try and move it up so that they could meet.
I see. Yeah, because I had heard August the last
They
time,
had
so.
said- They had said August,
Yeah.
that they're moving it up.
Okay.
My wife is on the tree commission, and I haven't heard her say anything about a meeting scheduled next month, perhaps, but I haven't heard.
Well, they were talking about hovering back on level 4 or something in the news in Idaho, so. And even level 3 in Ada County going back one step, so who knows?
One question, if you get to meet, Joel, you could bring us a report on what's really going on out there on A Street.
Good idea.
Give us an A Street report.
I've been very tempted to walk through there on one of my walks around town, just so I can see what's going on.
Yeah, if
Right,
you can find your way
right.
through it.
And are we going to get, in this current effort, are we going to get another a traffic circle? Is that circle down on Baker going to go this summer? Do you know?
Circle Drive's gonna cul-de-sac. It won't go through anymore.
I think the one on Baker
Well,
got
but the
delayed.
one at Baker was the proposed circle, and I don't know whether it's going to happen this summer, but it definitely is on the drawing board.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Well, it's an interesting thing, just as a comment about our city. We're building a 4-story building, keep in mind. In my mind, that's the first 4-story building we ever built in Moscow. It's kind of an exciting thing if you
Moscow
think
Hotel.
about it. Forget the university, you know, in terms of, but just in terms of the city, I don't think the McConnell building, it can really be considered 4 stories. It's
Isn't
kind of
Moscow
3 and a
Hotel
half.
4 stories?
But anyway, I think there's some exciting stuff, given the fact of our sickness and all the other stuff that's going on in our lives. There's some exciting things going on in Moscow, which I think are you know, with the new hospital building and a new bank, 2 new banks being built, and the new EMSI building, it's kind of an exciting moment in my mind. And I know there are a lot of people who want Moscow to remain a tiny little village, just like it was in 1940, but I don't happen to be one of those people.
We
So
definitely
I'm
have
kind of
more
excited.
urban entrances, and Victoria didn't, and speaking of identity, didn't you hear from Chuck Bond?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I
You
ran
want
it-
to
I
share
ran
that?
I ran into Chuck Bond, I was out walking and ran into Chuck Bond, he's got some apartments over there right at the edge of campus. I heard his voice, and he once again thanked the commission and Mike for getting that fence between him and identity.
Of course, he hasn't had any students around for the
And
last
it
6
completely,
months.
but he always brings it up, I run into him every once in a while.
Yeah.
And he always brings it up, and he's very grateful.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad we're
It solved
at
his
a
problem.
positive change. All right, any other announcements? Okay, well, see you,
So we're fine with canceling that first meeting in
yeah, I think
July?
we're canceling July 8th, and we're meeting on the is it the 22nd? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and we probably won't do a public hearing till August on this, the 5G.
Probably not on this, yeah, correct.
Okay, what if the FCC commissioner changes?
If there's a new order, then we'll have to assess it.
I was thinking about that. Who knows, but it's possible. Anyway, okay, well, thank you, everybody.
Happy 4th, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Stay healthy.
Bye.
Bye.